it'll be a little bit more formal, but it's for all the video and mic purposes. But I'll be back and forth kind of pointing at different slides. Thank you to Calvary Baptist Church. Y'all provided a great opportunity for me to go to Israel to be a part of an archaeological dig, but also being able to tour before we started the dig. The slides and these pictures are going to be the tour that we did before. So there's going to be a lot of sites. I think we have about 28 sites that we visited that I have pictures of. And so we'll kind of work through those. They're in the order that we traveled to them. I overthought and tried to arrange them in all these different ways, and I think we ended up just the simplest way of just going in the order that we went through. Some of them I'll mention verses. We'll go through verses kind of fast since there's a lot of sites, so if you want to write them down to look at them later. Some of them I might read out, but I'll be mentioning different verses of kind of different things going on in these sites. And as it is in Israel, these sites have been used since Old Testament to New Testament, so they're all over in dates. And so when we first got there, we flew into Tel Aviv, which is Jaffa, and our first site on our first day of touring is Eshkelon. Eshkelon is one of the 5 cities-states of the Philistines. So this is the first one we visited. We actually drove through Ashdod on the way to Ashkelon, so that's 2 Philistine cities that we got to visit. This man on the right or on the left here this is Dr. Seth Rodriguez. He is our archaeology professor at my school, so you're going to see a lot of pictures of him in these, because usually these pictures were taken whenever he was talking about the sites. So you'll see a bunch of him, and you'll see a bunch of my other professors and my other team. We went with a team of 17 students and professors from CCU, and you'll see them mixed in with the pictures as well. So this is the main gate coming into the city part of Eshkelon. So a lot of cities have kind of an outer city, and then when they have the wall, they'll have the inner city. So this is Eshkelon on the beach. He's sitting on, the little wooden part is a replica, but those bricks are the original bricks from the original city. So very cool to see. These were discovered in archaeology, and they dug it out and cleared it out and showed that the Greeks and Romans weren't actually the first ones to make an arch. They had existed for a long time before that. So this is, if you continue down through the city, Eshkelon's right on the beach. On the left, you see a little bit of the cliff. That's kind of the end of the city. And so the back side kind of has the wall, and then this side just goes straight into the Mediterranean. So we got to walk along the beach and kind of see what's left of the wall there. So very pretty site of Eshkelon, and there's stories of the people who got to excavate it. They got to swim in the Mediterranean Sea after excavating, which sadly we didn't get to do at Shiloh. And this is the kind of further back. This would be inside the walls. This part is really cool. Whenever we were there, we got a prophecy from Zephaniah 2:4. The prophecy talks about how the city of Eshkelon will be destroyed, and then the remnants and the remains of it will be taken and given to Judah, and then it will be used for people to lie down at night. It's kind of a weird prophecy reading it at that time, but as we talked about it here, this is now a campsite for modern-day Israel. So this was one of the first sites that we got to see, and we got to see it as a site that has prophecies that are still being fulfilled in the Bible. It was very kind of cool to see it come alive very early on. So this prophecy of people and the remnants of Israel laying down at night in the remains of the city came to life as it is now, the campsite that's used as one of the national parks there in Israel. This next picture is another city of the Philistines. We drove down to Tel Asafi Gath. Tel Asafi is the Arabic name that they used, that they now call it for excavation purposes. This is actually where our archaeology team and professors used to dig before we moved to Shiloh. So this is the picture of the Tel. You're going to see the word Tel in front of a lot of these sites. A Tel is a city that has been destroyed and then rebuilt by another group of people, and they kind of just make layers of cities, kind of like a cake. And as you see, these Tels make artificial, almost hills and mountains that will build up. So this city here, Gath, where Goliath is from, was built and destroyed a couple times to where it kind of builds up into this mountain. So this is the remains of part of Gath. We got to visit that for a little bit. We visited their old squares that they excavated in years past. We had lunch under a tree because it was very hot, and so we found a shade tree that was very nice. But we kind of visited this for just a little bit. This is Tel Lachish. Once again, Tel from it being destroyed. If you can see here, this kind of hill right here, that was not part of the Tel. That is actually a siege ramp that the Assyrians made whenever they destroyed. It's mentioned in 2 Kings 18 when Sennacherib comes to Israel to take the northern tribes. He comes south and takes a lot of the fortresses in Judah, and he takes Lachish, which was a very fortified city, and builds a ramp up to the wall to kind of make a siege ramp for it. And this is where Hezekiah comes and makes a deal with Sennacherib to, and he gives the gold and all the offerings from the temple, so Sennacherib does not continue on to destroy other cities. So this was a really cool site. I believe we have another picture of this one. This is within the walls, so once you walk up the Tel, you kind of have more of the actual city. This is a cool part. You'll see more pictures of walls like this, but there are walls at certain places that Solomon built up. This spot in particular, you kind of see a bench structure around. This is the gate of the city. Several times you have mentioned throughout the Bible, the gate of the city is where the elders met, or where kind of a court-type service was kind of held amongst the elders to make decisions of different marriage things, or just decisions about the city. And so this is you kind of see the benches around. This is a gate of the city, kind of what you can imagine of like this little in-cut into the wall where the elders and the men would meet and talk about different things going on. And this last one, this is the siege relief. The Assyrians, whenever they took Lachish, they liked to kind of boast about all their victories and the things that they did and the places that they took. So they would make these reliefs and take them back home and put them in the palaces and the castles of the generals and the kings that made them. So this is the siege of Lachish. It's on the very left, you see kind of arrows and points. That's them actually going up the Tel and taking the Tel and kind of some of the siege warfare. And then towards the right are kind of taking the city and the people into captivity. This is actually a replica from the Israel Museum. I think the real one is in the British Museum. But it is kind of just cool to see it kind of being pulled together. So you have examples of this being done in Assyria, and they have this for several different sites, and it kind of ties them together. You have the place in Israel that was actually sieged, and you have evidence in Assyria of what they did in their own account. So it kind of works together with biblical works that we have. So this is going down a little bit. So this is in Deference Abdullah Park. This is actually not a very touristy or very visited place, which was very nice. It's kind of just this little park. And as you see on the right, while we were pulling up, a whole herd of goats and shepherds came. And so we got an unexpected visit from a whole bunch of sheep and goats, which was very cool to see. At the very top, you see a little bit of an olive tree. So it feels like extra is really in Jewish because of just that whole experience. And then on the left, you'll see this is a limestone cave, and they have carved into it different squares and triangles. Whenever we first got there, it was kind of weird to see. You think it's some type of art, but it's actually, this was how they would kind of cultivate all the different pigeons and birds that they would use for offerings. They would either use different caves or different walls that they had made, and they would carve these shapes so the birds would come and lay nests in them. So it would be kind of a bird-type farm. And so for places of high sacrifices, they need a lot more birds than you can just find in one nest. So they would make these artificial places for the nest so they could have hundreds of birds that they could use they could use the droppings for fertilizer, the eggs for eating, but also the birds for sacrifices. So these are all over Israel, and we got to see a whole kind of natural cave that had an opening, and this was like surrounded all the way around, which is really cool to see. So this is the walkway to the tomb. If you go to the next slide, you'll get to see pictures. So this is the outside of the tomb. So this is a ways away from Jerusalem, but this is a tomb built about the same time as the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. So this is not the tomb that Jesus was laid in, but it's one that's of a very similar style and a similar time. If you'll see, the sun is very bright here on the right, but you start to see kind of a circle stone coming out of the wall. So this is kind of that stone that would be rolled down, and this tomb has it inside the wall, and this is a view from inside the tomb. So this is looking out. This tomb has kind of would have been fully covered out in the front, but over time has kind of lost some of its stones and some of the plaster that would have contained it in. But this is kind of the walls that you see on the side are where they laid the bodies in another little compartment. This tomb was a little bit bigger than what Jesus would have been laid in. It had multiple compartments, but it was a very cool kind of representation to see and to kind of imagine the feeling of being in the tomb, and very, very similar to when Jesus would have been in. And this is our last place from this first day of touring. We visited a lot of sites and not a lot of time. We went about 4 or 5 days and visited most all these sites. So this is our last one. You can see the sun setting in the far left picture. I kind of had to take fragments of a panorama picture, but this is the Elah Valley. So this is the Mount of Sukkah that we are standing on this side, and the other side is, I forget the name of but this is the Elah Valley in between. This is most famous for the battle of David and Goliath. It talks about in 1 Samuel 17 that the Israelites camped on the side that we are standing, and the Philistines were on the mountain just on the other side, on the hills. And so we had two major armies standing with this valley in between. This is also right down kind of the stream from Gath. So if you just walk down the stream from Gath, it takes you straight to this valley. So we talked about Goliath coming from Gath. All he had to do was walk out of the city, follow the stream all the way down to where you come to this campsite, or this battleground here. So this was very cool to just overlook. Right now there's a giant highway that goes straight through the valley. It's these same trade routes and kind of roads and paths that were used in these ancient times are still usually in use today because they have the best kind of geography of it. So this ancient valley is now also just a highway. But we got to kind of read 1 Samuel, read the David and Goliath passage here on the hills in the valley, and that's how we ended the first day of touring. We started the second day. We went to Caesarea Maritima. This is King Herod's beach palace. King Herod was a great builder in Israel at this time, and he built palaces all over Israel. We'll see a couple of them. But this is kind of, I'm guessing, his favorite because it's right here on the beach. Other than King Herod living in it and building it, this is also known in Acts 23. It talks about Paul stayed at house arrest in this palace. So while he's in this palace, it overlooks the beach on 3 of the sides, and then it has kind of the land on the one side. So this is the main Roman port. Whenever King Herod comes, he builds this one port. So this is the main port of Israel at the time. So the Israelites, anytime they're using the port or trading with Rome, they're coming out of Caesarea Maritima. This is, you see the green kind of slab. This is Roman concrete. Romans invented concrete for this use of kind of making these docks at this time, but they would lower the wet concrete and the water would cure it and then it would dry. And they have a humongous type of beach port that comes out of the city. This is the kind of the more industrial ones used for commercial use. King Herod has his own private one on the other side. That he kept separate, and then they had the commercial use. So this port is also significant since this is the only port in Israel. This is also the port that you're going to have Paul and Peter and everybody else that we have stories of them leaving Israel or sailing up the coast. It's going to be coming out of this port, walking on these concrete slabs that would have gone out and that were any type of boats going up into the Mediterranean. It goes through this port, which was very significant. Now we are going up to Tel Megiddo. Is mentioned several times in the Old Testament. The Indiana Jones looking man at the bottom, that is our professor, Dr. David Cotter. He's looking out at the Jezreel Valley from Megiddo. In in 1 Kings 9, it is mentioned that Solomon built up the walls in certain of the cities. Visiting the cities, he did it at Lachish, he did it at Jerusalem, but he also did it here at Megiddo. Each of these cities that he built up the walls were very important cities to the dynasty and to the kingdom. Megiddo is very important because you'll see from the next picture, but first here, you see 4 columns on the left. These are kind of excavated and then kind of rebuilt just a little bit. They called these the Solomonic gates. He used this structure of having 4 towers, and then in these 3 little inlets, there would be 3 ginormous doors. In a wall, whenever a solid wall all the way around, the gates are the most vulnerable parts because they have holes in them that people come in and out all the time. So you have to have a way to fortify them. And so Solomon, this is how Solomon did it. So you'll see these type of gates all over Israel. The one with the gate of the elders at the first, it was one of these gates as well, and Lachish. And you'll see another one at Tel Hatzor. And so this is this is the remnants of that with some reconstructed. And then you'd have to go, no, it would be doors that would open up. So the doors would kind of open up into these chambers, but it was layers of doors. So I think it was 3 different doors that you'd have to get through. So if any army was trying to attack, they have 3 ginormous doors built of wood and metal and whatever else that they put in them to kind of fortify it.
So the doors are actually, especially looking down, the doors are going across.
Yes, the doors would be going here, here, and here. So he would be looking in from the city, looking out into the Jezreel Valley. So this would be, right there. And then you would have kind of guard posts on both sides protecting it. And this is why the city is so important, why you have to protect it. The Megiddo is on kind of the mountainside of the Jezreel Valley. So this is the last kind of mountain until into the distance to where all this farmland is controlled by Megiddo. You also have this modern road here, which is one of the king's highways, which passes through Megiddo. So anybody who controls Megiddo controls most of the agriculture in Israel. They're going through history. Tel Megiddo has 22 different destruction layers. That means there are 22 successful destructions and captures of the city, so it can be taken over and put into their own use. This is one of the highest and the most layers that you'll hear of destruction layers within a tel. It's because of such an important site that it is used for these purposes of controlling all of it. It also gets a mention in Revelations, Armageddon. One of the revelations is you have the Valley of the 5 Armies. This would be this giant Jezreel Valley with apocalyptic literature places the different armies surrounding this tel. It's kind of like the stage to where you have the tel and then you have a valley kind of all the way around it, about at this angle to where you have the end of the mountain range, and all around is farmland. And then just even the battles that happened then, all this farmland would just be hundreds of acres of battlegrounds as well. This is also in the top of Megiddo. If you can kind of see, they have on this left is an actual feeding trough. So these are stone feeding troughs, ones that were used in Israel at this time, very common throughout from Old Testament into New Testament. The right is kind of a reconstruction of it. They have kind of artistically made metal horses feeding into it, and there's several of them kind of in this stable structure. This was very significant because this is something that would be very similar to possibly one that Jesus would have been laid in. These feeding troughs made out of stone were much more common. Today we think of either kind of the wooden structure, but wood is a little bit more scarce. It's there, but it's going to be a lot more expensive. And something that's more accessible and will last longer will be stone. So these stone carvings you see kind of carved into in a square shape, and then kind of still having these walls. So this is something very possibly that they would have had throughout the city of Bethlehem, or in the stables that when they laid Jesus into it, could very possibly be something of these like stone troughs. It's very cool to kind of see these connections to the life of Jesus. You see them all throughout Israel, just understanding kind of the context of how people lived in Israel it kind of, you get pieces of like, oh, okay, this is in Jesus' life, and that's in Jesus' life. And these kind of pieced together are all throughout Israel. And so this one is from Megiddo. So talking more about Jesus' life, this city in the distance is modern-day Nazareth. Nazareth is a very busy and bustling modern city. So we didn't actually get to go into Nazareth because all you would get to see is a modern city. There's not many ruins. There's not many excavations at the site of Nazareth. But right next to Nazareth, as you'll see in this picture, is an ancient Roman city that was being built at the time in the life of Jesus. This is quite possibly the place that Joseph and Jesus would have built. It is said that they are carpenters or builders, and so that can be builders of stone and builders of wood. We aren't 100% sure of that. So this is a city that's being built. Nazareth is still in the back, so it's just a ways. So it's very likely that Joseph and Jesus would come and possibly have worked on this site, on this city that was being built at the time of Jesus, as kind of contractors or construction workers of the time building a city. You see kind of the remains of roads and different columns. And this is the site of Sepphoris, or Sepphoris. It's pronounced several different ways and spelled just as many different ways. But this is a site that has kind of a lower city, and then at the top it has this villa, kind of this rich man that kind of controls the city. And at the villa, they found something very significant in this next picture. When they excavated, they now have a covering over it. So there's now a building containing this. This is a mural, a dining room mural, that would be around the table. You see at the bottom part here, all the way around, about a third of the bottom is no murals. And you even have these little corner spots to where it looks like you would place a table. Since these murals, this is a very detailed and expensive mural, they did not spend the money to put it where the table was going to cover up the mural. So this is a Roman-style table called a triclinium, where you have three sides to where it makes almost like a U shape. And you would have people laying on all sides as a lower table laying on and reclining their arm as they would eat. Many scholars and my professors as well believe this is more of the type of table that they would have used at the Last Supper. This also has a lot of significance. Since you are on your side, you would have somebody on your back and you would have somebody facing you. So you would usually have people you would trust more to your back. And in the Last Supper story, he talks about he hands something to the left to Judas and he talks to the right to John, giving more context to nobody suspected Judas as being the betrayer, because he was the one that even Jesus had as the more trusted position in kind of the cultural stance at the table. So something like this, just giving a little bit more context into that scene. Since it's outside Nazareth, this is not a table or not anywhere that I think Jesus ever lived or ate, but it's something that's important that allows you to kind of visualize it more in any other places. Yeah. This is now the third day of touring. This is here. The first 2 days we stayed in Tel Aviv, which was old Joppa or Jaffa. We then moved over up to the Sea of Galilee and stayed at the Panorama Hotel in Tiberias off the Sea of Galilee. So right north of Tiberias, we have this kind of mountain that we went up into, the Arbel Cliffs, and this is looking off into the Arbel Cliffs into the Sea of Galilee. So as you see on the right side, you have kind of pastures and you have different hills. And on the left, you have more kind of dramatic cliffs and also different kind of coves and valleys. If you can see on the very left picture, there's a city down at the bottom. This city is right off the coast of the Sea of Galilee. That is the city of Magdala. Mary Magdalene would be from the city of Magdala. And so this is the city right off the coast. The original city is right off the coast, but it's kind of expanded now in the modern city, expanding out. These cliffs kind of have more of a dramatic geography, and they also have, since they are made of stone, they hold sound very well. So it would be something like in these cliffs or these hills where Jesus would give his sermons. The Sermon of the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount is actually just a little north, little past the city of Magdala. And these cities, since they have these hills, and kind of work as natural amphitheaters. So people wonder, how could Jesus talk to giant crowds? If you were standing on one side of a hill, kind of speaking to people sitting alongside a hill, these rocks and these different stones work as kind of natural amphitheaters, amplifying sound. So there is possibilities of Jesus talking to multiple people and them all hearing his voice with kind of just the geography of these hills, just around in this area on this side of the Sea of Galilee. From here, we drove up to just north, at the very north part of the Sea of Galilee on the coast is Capernaum. Capernaum is kind of where Jesus had the main part of his ministry. This is also where we have Peter living. So we'll get to see Peter's house in a little bit. What this structure is, this is the second century construction of the synagogue in Capernaum. In Capernaum, you have a lot of travelers coming, and Christianity is booming and using Peter's house as kind of the central part of Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So what the Jewish people did to kind of retaliate as the site of Peter is becoming more famous, they build a much fancier and very nice white marble synagogue. So this structure is put onto a basalt base, which is this foundation here. Just looks like a black line at the very bottom. That is the foundation to the tabernacle, or to the synagogue that Jesus would have spoken to, that Peter would have been to, that they would have visited several times in the Gospels in Capernaum. So this is a new synagogue put on top of it, which is only a couple hundred years after Jesus. So the style will be the same, but it's going to be a totally different color and different style. This is within the synagogue. You can see very ornate columns that go up very tall. This is my professor, Dr. Rodriguez, kind of for scale. He's about my height, so he's not super tall. And so it gives more scale to kind of how tall this building would be. So in Capernaum now, they have these columns. They have Greek and Latin on the columns that wouldn't have been there. But this structure of the columns surrounded with the 4 different walls was a very common style of synagogues. This is how they constructed them. And in the next picture, you'll see the benches that went along the walls. So these men and women would have sat along the walls all the way around the church, and listening to the speaker, who would be sitting right next to the door in the seat of Moses, what they called it. It would be this stone chair right by the front and back door, so they would all be hearing, and they could walk around these columns. But this would be kind of the structure. Everybody would be sitting around kind of this room as one person was reading or teaching, much like Jesus did multiple times. And there's even things in the gospel of him talking about it in the synagogues. This is from the end of the synagogue. You can see just across the street, this giant structure that looks like a spaceship is a modern cathedral that they built special to be over the house of Peter. So the house of Peter is a holy site that has multiple structures built around it to protecting it. And this is now owned by kind of Catholic priests and preserved by them. And so they wanted to build a cathedral to kind of honor this special and holy place to Christianity. But they didn't want to have to destroy the ground or destroy what remains of Peter's house. So they built a floating cathedral that sits on different stilts that now looks over it. So this is just right across the street from the synagogue. This is very important. Usually people being this close to the synagogue or in town would be more of the wealthy people, which leads some people to believe that Peter could have possibly been a very wealthy fisherman or wealthy man in the town of Capernaum. And then you see this basalt, these city structures all the way throughout in between. Basalt is a volcanic rock that's mined here in Capernaum. So you'll see it all throughout Israel, these millstones and these Capernaum structures, and these basalt structures, they all come from Capernaum. So it's very interesting to see as you go all the way throughout Israel, you'll see these basalt structures, and they all had to come through this city. So the city is very wealthy because all of their grindstones and how you make wheat comes from the volcanic rock, which they have access to, which all of the rest of Israel has to come and get from them. This is from Capernaum. This is the Sea of Galilee. This is looking down the long ways. So the Sea of Galilee is about a mile wide and 8 miles long. So this is looking down the 8 miles wide side. And so you can see the coast on both sides. And it's very interesting to see when you think of the story of the the storm on the Sea of Galilee is not a very big sea. It's actually much more of a lake, but because of the significance in history, they call it a sea. It is fresh water, and it feels like a lake when you get into it. But they call it the Sea of Galilee, and this is just a view looking down along it. And this here is the palace of Hatzor. Hatzor is one of the only places in the conquest. It mentions in Joshua 11 that this is the only place in the conquest that is burned. This is the king's palace looking out into the valley, kind of the kingdom of there at Hatzor. It's very dark on the sides, but these are totally burned, and the rocks at the bottom are totally cracked from the heat of the fire. So you have evidence of there being a great fire here in the palace, and around it you have the fortified city of Hatzor. But this is looking out from the palace, and with it covered, and if you have the doors open, it was worked as like natural air conditioning as well, which is really cool. One thing that's also very important is, where do you get your water in Israel? Israel having, in ancient times, water is the life source of different things. So different cities did very dramatic things to find the water. In Jerusalem, later on, we find Hezekiah's tunnel, bringing water into the city, because usually water would be right outside the city, and that would be a very vulnerable spot. So several times in these ancient cities, you have these giant structures. This one is these rocks that go down all the way about 100 feet into a tunnel that you can then walk to the little spring. And the next picture shows how deep it goes. So this is how deep the staircase would go. So these giant public works just to get to water. This is how significant water is to these cultures and to these people, that these analogies of living water and water would be very well understood as how important that is. And speaking of how important water is, this is Tel Dan. Tel Dan is the start of the Jordan River. It is, you come through all of Israel, which seems so much like a desert, and then you come to Tel Dan, and it's like a tropical rainforest. There is so much water. There's tropical plants, tropical birds, tropical flowers all throughout, and there's just water gushing everywhere, because this is the spring that fills all the Jordan River that leads down into the Dead Sea. This is the place of the altar. We are told later that whenever there is the break in the kingdom of the southern and the northern, there are two temples put up in the northern tribes. One is put at Tel Dan, and one is put right north of the Judean territory. This is where the altar would have been in the northern territory at Tel Dan. This structure of this altar in front of the kind of tabernacle structure, it's simulating the temple that Solomon built. So it's the same style, same order with the altar in front, with the tabernacle the temple that you worship in. So this is the structure of the altar. The next picture is the base of, this would be the tabernacle that they built. Instead, in the Holy of Holies, instead of holding the Ark of the Covenant like there was in Jerusalem, they put the golden calf. So when you would worship the golden calf at these different sites, it would be in the same type of structure of the tabernacle. So it's all simulating these structures, and this is the site of that. And just right beyond this territory, where that big tree is the start of Lebanon. So this is on the border of Israel, which is now still very fought over territory. And this looks like a pile of rocks, because it is, but there's something very significant that they found here. At the edge of Tel Dan has these giant walls, these giant stone structures. At this one in particular, there was found a stone that kind of settled the debate. From the 80s and 90s, there was a great debate archaeologically and academically if King David, was ever an actual historic person. There were claims that there were no historic basis that you could base him on other than the Bible. So they wanted, many non-biblical scholars said David didn't exist because there's no evidence of it, and because they'd not see the Bible as a historical document. At this site, there was found a stone that came from the time of the first whenever Assyria attacked. And at this time, the attacking king made a relief that said something like, boasting about what they did, leaving his name, and at the bottom it says, "I wiped out all the house of David here at this site." So this was one of the largest archaeological evidence of the King David, the name of David, the house of David being used, which settled that debate of people saying David isn't a real person, David never existed. This settled that debate because of a stone that was found here that somebody had removed from its original position and built into a totally different wall. So this different kind of stone wording settled that debate. So this site's very significant just for that for adding that context to the academic side of the Bible. Yeah. Many people, so the official stance of what they call archaeological minimalists don't believe in the Bible, and they try to deconstruct in what is left of the story. So it's actually very sad to see some of the official stances of Israel, and in the Israel Museum, don't take into account the Bible as the history. So a lot of people, they would claim they don't know where the tribes of Israel come from. Some claim that Israel is just a Canaanite tribe, which over time became monotheist and happened to become the reigning kings at some point. I'm trying to deconstruct what we believe as the Bible. And that's what all these sites show. Not one thing in archaeology can prove the Bible or can prove anything is true, but these make this case that the Bible is historically accurate. And that's what all these different sites are, where people say, no, the Bible isn't historically accurate, we can't know any of this. They try to take away all sense of their history that you kind of have to show is like, no, there's great evidence in the Bible that matches with other archaeological and scientific evidence. It's all over, yep. This is my favorite site. This is Beth Shan, known as Scythopolis at Roman times. So this is an entire Roman city that's nearly been fully excavated. There was a very wealthy donor who gave a blank check to an archaeologist, and so he excavated nearly the entire town. So you see kind of the Roman Cardo, which is the main road toward the right where you have the columns, and then you have just the structure. In about 700, 800 AD, there was an earthquake that kind of made all the columns fall down, so the city was abandoned, and it worked to preserve the city and all the columns very well. So archaeologists, as they found this, they resurrected some of these columns and some of these structures from where they laid up. So it's now you can see the great layout of a Roman city as it would have been. The Scythians are mentioned in the Bible in Colossians 3. It talks about the barbarians and the Scythians. The Scythians never lived at this site, but the Romans just named it after them because they were somewhere in the area. So this was my favorite site, being able to see a full kind of Roman-style city, almost nearly fully excavated. And then getting to Jericho, we can end here with Jericho. So I have 3 pictures here of Jericho. This first one, there is a circular structure down at the bottom. This is the oldest known structure to man. This is a giant pre-Canaanite structure that goes all the way down. It's not known if it's a temple or if it's a silo, but it's a giant, massive structure built out of stone, very roughly erected, that we aren't quite sure what it was used for. But the dating and how low this is in the site of Jericho, this is the oldest known structure to man. So right now we don't know of anything that is older. So very significant in this whole site. One of the things that makes Jericho very important to archaeologists, but there's other reasons that we get to talk about. This is the containment wall. So many times in cities they would have a containment wall kind of holding as the foundation of it. So this is a wall that has evidence all around it that would still be standing. This would be out of stone and of dirt that would be holding kind of the foundations of the city. So this is a zoomed into, and there's kind of an archaeologically in the 1930s, Kathleen Kent, I forget her name, the famous archaeologist kind of cut a giant trench, and it goes all the way through, and this is the kind of the wall that they found. This next picture shows this same side of the wall on the other side of the city. This is the containment city. This would work as the foundations of the city. And then you see something that looks like a fallen wall to the left, right here. That is actual, so what they would use is they would take a foundation of the wall out of stone, and then they would build mud brick walls on top. This is mud brick. This is a mud brick wall which has fallen down from all around Jericho. It's found all the way around Jericho. And it works almost as a ramp, how it's fallen in different areas. It's fallen out in different areas to where it almost works as a ramp for people that could run in. It works very well with the story of Jericho, of being able to siege into the city, that instead of having to make siege works or siege ramps like we saw at Lachish or different sites that take years to build, you have ones like this that God made naturally within seconds. How much time do we have? We're good? Okay, cool. Then we'll keep going. This is Qumran. Qumran is not mentioned in the Bible, but it is the place of the Essenes. These are kind of Jewish monks who wanted to leave kind of what was happening in Jerusalem, what the different groups were doing, what the Pharisees and the Sadducees were doing to Judaism in Israel and at these cities. This community wanted to break away and try to stay more true. So they made a desert community, and they are most commonly known for writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is the community that wrote most of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then when the Romans were coming, they stored most of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is what's left of their monastery structure. And this next picture shows at the very bottom, right here, that is cave number 4, where several hundreds of different manuscripts and pieces of manuscripts were found. So it's several of these caves all throughout these cliffs. You can see this kind of cliff structure with many different kind of holes and caves littered all over. These are where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, where we have the oldest evidence of the Isaiah scrolls, of the different texts that line up with our modern translations, which show that the translation efforts were very closely detailed. And so this is that site. So very significant, not in the Bible, very significant to us and as who use Bible translations today. These next 3 pictures are going to be on one of the days. This is a Friday, so the Sabbath or Shabbat. This is at the western wall. That is the Dome of the Rock. So this is the Temple Mount here. This is crowded, filled with people celebrating Shabbat. So this is their Sunday, their worship, their holy day on Saturday. It starts at sundown Friday. So this is it, going through the experience, going down to see what they're worshiping and really kind of going through at Shabbat. Was very filling, worshiping a God that has already come down, and it was kind of a sad moment where we get to see how much fervor they had for worship, but for God but praying and asking for something that was already fulfilled through Jesus. On that last picture, you have these stones. These are, and whenever Jerusalem was sacked in AD 70 by the Romans, the tabernacle was destroyed, and the rocks were thrown off the Temple Mount. These giant rocks down here are the tabernacle, the Herod's tabernacle, that were destroyed onto a first century city. So as Jesus walks down the street and talks to the disciples and those around him, saying, "These stones, not one of them will stand," and they say, "How is that so? This structure took 40 years to build, and you're going to destroy it in 3 days?" Jesus is talking about himself and his own body, but he's also talking about these are the stones that he's pointing at and talking to as he's walking along a road like this or one of these round, talking about these stones that will fall. And just a couple decades after his crucifixion, the Romans destroy it, and the stones do come down just like he talks about as well. This is the Israel Museum. We walked to there because it was Shabbat, so none of the buses were there, were running. And so they have a large kind of reconstructed model of first century Jerusalem. So this is what Jerusalem would have looked something like at the time of Jesus. You see in the middle, the massive structure is the temple. You have King Herod expanding the Temple Mount and rebuilding the temple in very much of kind of a Greek Roman style, but still with the Jewish thing. So you have kind of the walls around it. And then you have here, you kind of see it, there's a 4-walled structure. This is the Roman kind of main barracks for the army. So when you have the story of Paul being having a mob attacking him at the tabernacle, he's actually taken right there at the corner of the temple off by the Roman troops, where he gives the sermon of what the Jews have done to Jesus while the Romans are protecting him. That whole story happens just right there in what would be that little corner of the Temple Mount. Here is a picture of this is a picture of the great Isaiah scroll that was found in one of the caves at Qumran. This one, it wraps around this giant column. It is several feet long, and it is several different parchments of skin that are sewn together. They no longer display the actual scroll because it would damage the scroll, rolling it backwards and exposing it to this much light. So this is a high definition picture that they have of the scroll that you can see the Hebrew all the way through. And this is a different document. Before the great Isaiah scroll, this was the oldest known translation of the Bible, or manuscript of the Bible that was used. I forgot its exact name, but this was written in about the 9th or 10th century AD. So medieval times, this was copied. This was the oldest version that we could trace back to the Bible. Whenever the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Great Isaiah Scrolls were found, it was able to push that date back nearly 1,000 years, to where now our oldest manuscripts that our Bible translations are made out of come from 200 BC rather than about 1,000 AD. So great significant finding these scrolls with understanding some of the theories that people have of the Bible being written later or made up or falsified. These different theories are disproved by different finds and evidences of things like this. This is another one of Herod's palace. So that other one at Caesarea was his beach palace. This is his mountain fortress. So this is a replica of it, kind of showing the terrain. So he would have been kind of on the edge of the mountain here. This is known being built by Herod, but is most famously being known that many of the Jewish refugees running from Jerusalem and running from different sites when the Romans were destroying in 70 AD, they held out here at Masada. So the Jews took this structure and used it as their own little city that they lived in for several years as the Romans were coming to destroy them. This next picture is another kind of replica of it, but this is what the mountain looks like today. So you have a little bit right here is where the Herod structure would have been. And then right here is a siege ramp that the Romans built. This was kind of the fortresses of all fortresses. And so when the Romans sieged, this was the last holdout of Israel in 70 AD at the Great Revolt. So the Romans built a wall surrounding this entire mountain and built multiple camps around it as they sieged this city. This next picture, this is what remains of the siege ramp that the Romans built. They spent 3 years taking this city, building a siege ramp as it got closer and closer to the city. And once this was taken, this was kind of the Alamo for Israel and for Rome. This is kind of the greatest feat that the Romans could do. This was one of the most fortified places on earth, and the Romans were able to take it, and they used it as kind of their boasting amount of like, remember Masada, we can do anything type of thing for the Romans. So this was the last holdout of the Israelites in the Great Revolt. This is En-Gedi. This is a great spring down the desert. This is where David hid out from Saul. It says he stayed at the fortress of En-Gedi, quite possibly Masada. But this is the actual spring, a beautiful little lush area in the middle of a desert. And then here, moving into, these are the sites as touring of Jerusalem. So this one is the pools of Bethsaida, as mentioned in John 5. Kind of the parts that are been excavated. This is the garden tomb. This is another tomb built similar to the time of Jesus, not believed to be the one Jesus was laid in, but one closer to Jerusalem. That is a garden tomb surrounded by wine presses, so there was a garden around it. So very similar to one that Jesus was in. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Where Golgotha and Calvary were, they have now built several different churches that have kind of morphed into one giant church, which is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There are 6 different denominations of Christianity here in the church, and that this actual sepulcher is over where they believe the tomb where Jesus was laid. This has very early kind of historical significance to being supported in the early hundreds to being. This is Hezekiah's broad wall. Whenever Sennacherib and the Syrians are coming down, we are told that they siege at Lachish in multiple cities. We're also told that Hezekiah builds up the walls in Jerusalem. This is a 23-foot wide wall that is built. You can see the stones are very small, so it's very rushed kind of wall building job that they had as kind of the public works. And it's just kind of now there in the middle of the street in the Jewish quarter of the Old City. These are the Old City rampart walls. These are built at the time of the Crusades, but they follow most of the way around Jerusalem with the Old City walls. Some parts they kind of are different. But this is walking around the walls one day. And from this site, we were able to see this next picture. This is a modern parking lot, but it is over where Herod's palace was. So Jesus being brought before Herod happens where these cars are now today. So this is used as a parking lot here to a church, but this is believed to be exactly where Herod's palace was. There have been several efforts to try to excavate it, but since it's a very used parking lot, it's very hard to get the rights to excavate there. This is from the same rampart wall. This is getting the view of the Mount of Olives, mentioned multiple times in different prophecies, and where Jesus ascended from in Acts 1. This is, Mount of Olives kind of has three different kind of mounts that you can kind of see, and it's all east of the city. And the city of David, which we'll go to, is going to be kind of the northern parts. The last thing on this day on one of our tours of Jerusalem, this is closer to the wall. So that the pictures from Shabbat were a little bit farther from the wall. This is right up to the western wall, or sometimes called the Wailing Wall. The Temple Mount is just right up top. You can kind of see different types and styles of stones. This has been rebuilt over the eras. The very top, which is the small stones, which is the darker, that's going to be built during the time of the Crusades. At the very bottom, you have very large rocks. Those are Herodian stones. So those are original stones that King Herod would have had constructed whenever he rebuilt the tabernacle. This is going away from there just a ways to city of David. So this is a royal structure at the top of a hill at the city of David, which is believed to be King David's palace. Here are found large stones, which aren't found in just regular houses, and there are also columns which match the type of Jewish royalty of the time of David. So this is believed to be kind of that site where David would have built his palace, and just north of him would have been the Temple Mount. So this is just south of the Temple Mount. This is looking up the wall. So David's palace would be up the top, and there is this large kind of wall that is kind of fortifying it. So you have several stories of David, even when he's looking at Bathsheba, looking down into the city. This is kind of the wall that David's palace would have been built up into, kind of overlooking part of the city. And then one of the last places, on the very last day, we got to go down into Hezekiah's tunnel. Just like we said about the water, water is very precious, and to get to it is usually you have to go outside the city, which would be very vulnerable in times of siege. So preparing for this siege, Hezekiah has tunnels built from both sides, which connect this water spring, which happens right outside of Jerusalem, connecting it into the inner parts of Jerusalem, so the city has access to other things of water. So this is our last thing that we did on the touring part, and we will talk about Tel Shiloh just a little bit